Hey guys, Richard Holdner here. Welcome to the channel. I've got a question for you. Which one makes more power? A 500 horsepower, 5.3 liter LM7 Gen 3 motor or a 500 horsepower, 5.3 liter L83 Gen 5 motor? Is that a silly question? Let's find out. In this video, we're going to take a look at a comparison between a Gen 3 5.3 liter LM7, both in stock and modified trim, and we're going to compare that to a Gen 5 5.3 liter L83, also in stock and modified trim. And guess what? Both of these motors in modified trim made over 500 horsepower. They also made exactly the same peak torque number. But guess what? The power curves couldn't be more different. I'll show you what I mean. Before we can get going in our comparison between an LM7 and an L83, we need to take a look at what they did in stock trim and then take a look at what they did in modified trim. I have another video up already kind of comparing them in stock trim and also compared to a 6-liter LQ4, which makes an interesting comparison between the 5.3-liter L83 and the larger 6-liter. But I never got to compare these in modified trim because up till now, I hadn't run any modified versions of the L83. But this is kind of cool. So we're going to take a look at two 500 horsepower modified versions, but before we can do that, we need to take a look at both these motors in stock trim. And also I want to show you what each one of the modifications did to these individual motors, starting with the LM7. So we have a stock LM7 that I got from the wrecking yard. All that we do the things that we normally do on these things. We took it apart because we were going to be running boost on this. I put ring gap in it. We just did the razor blade rebuild on the heads and stuff. And on the deck surface, we put new head gaskets on it. We put head studs on it because, again, we were going to be running boost. But before we do anything, we ran it in stock trim. That meant stock throttle body or a stock size manual throttle body, because sometimes we have to replace them if we get a late enough motor where we have the drive-by-wire stuff, if we get something that's later than 2002. So stock throttle body, stock truck intake, stock 706 or 862 heads, all the stock bottom end. And this being an LM7, it had the dish piston in it. It has the stock camshaft. We did run it with long tube headers. In this case, these were 1 7/8. They make about the same power with an 1 3/4 on this stock 5.3 because they're just not very powerful. We ran long tube headers and collector extensions. We optimized the tune with the Holley HP management system and had no accessories. We run the motor a little colder, and as I said, with an optimized tune, that's why it makes more power this way that we test it than it does when it's rated by the factory, which is a completely different test parameter. So run in stock trim in this manner on the engine dyno, it made 354.5 horsepower. And 381 foot-pounds. Now these range when I get them from the wrecking yard, depending on how well they've been taken care of and how much blow-by they have and how many miles and all that. They can range from 300 in mid-40s or so up to something like this, 355 or so. So they're all kind of in this range, and the torque output will range from 372.3 all the way up to 383. But they're kind of in that 10 horsepower, 10 foot-pound range. Now I want to show you, before we compare it to the LM7 or to the L83, let's take a look and see what we did when we modified this version. So this was our modified LM7 that made over 500 horsepower, 503 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 443 foot-pounds of torque. Yeah, 442.7. And you'll note that most of the gains from the modifications came after 4,000 RPM. There wasn't a big drop below that, but there weren't any significant gains below that. This modified combination was the stock bottom end. In fact, this one was the basis for our Big Bang 5.3 liter that we made 1,300 horsepower with the stock bottom end. But to get it to make power, we augmented the top end of it. The first thing we did was obviously put a camshaft in it. This one was a Comp 281 LRR, which is this one was the 54-459-11 cam. So it was a 617, 624 lift split, a 231, 239 degree duration split, and 113 degree lobe separation angle. This also had a set of CNC ported TrickFlow 215 heads on. So very, very good heads for this combination. They flow a ton. They can support another 100 horsepower above this if we had enough motor to do so. So there were more than enough cylinder head for this combination. We also had a fast LSXRT intake manifold and 102 2mm throttle body. So with those changes, the power output jumped to over 500 horsepower. So now let's take a look at a comparison between the LM7 and the L83. But before we do that, we'll look at the L83 stock and modified, then we can compare the two. Now that we've taken a look at the 5.3 liter LM7, it's time to take a look at the Gen 5 5.3 liter L83. And like with the LM7, we ran this both in stock trim and in modified version where this thing exceeded 500 horsepower. So we're going to take a look at that. We ran this motor stock on the dyno at Westech. The interesting thing is running this motor at Westech, and then the guys from Brian Tooley Racing also ran one out at their place on a different dyno with a different tuner and all of that completely different. The interesting thing is the two motors, the two power curves overlay exactly. I mean, they're within 1 or 2 horsepower everywhere. So we know a couple things. First of all, that these motors are very repeatable, but even run at different dyno places with different tuners and different temperatures and all kinds of stuff. There's lots and lots of repeatability here because this is what they do. So we ran this motor with long tube headers with a modified version of the stock air intake. Obviously, the tune was optimized. And we ran this at about 150 or so degrees. And this thing ran good. I mean, it did what we expect of these L83s. And the impressive thing is how much torque they make. This thing made 405 horsepower, 432 foot-pounds of torque, and over 400 foot-pounds all the way down past 3,000 RPM. So this thing did very well. And the interesting thing is to get these motors to make more than 500 horsepower. This is what the curve looked like. This combination made 513 horsepower and 444 foot-pounds of torque. So it did very well. But this was with the only changes that we made. We had the stock cylinder heads, obviously the stock short block, but it was with a Brian Tooley Racing Stage 4 cam. Now, in order to fit that cam in, they did have to go in and massage the dome on the piston a little bit just to get make sure that they had enough piston to valve clearance for this particular camshaft. They ran an MSD intake manifold, which is interesting because the MSD is quite a bit shorter than either the factory L83 or L86 intake manifold. So it'll be interesting to compare this combination with the short runner manifold compared to the relatively longer runner fast manifold run on the LM7 5.3 liter. So these are the power outputs for the stock and modified version of the L83. Now let's compare the 5.3 liter LM7 to the 5.3 liter L83. Now that I've shown you a comparison between the stock version and the modified version, both of the 5.3 liter LM7 and the 5.3 liter L83, let's compare the two and see how those two compare. This is our stock 5.3 liter LM7, the Gen 3 version, and here's how it compares to the stock L83. And I've shown this before in another video, and we've shown it a couple of times actually, and you can see that the 5.3 liter L83 just basically makes more power everywhere. It's everything that the LM7 is, just more of it basically. And not surprisingly, it has better cylinder heads, it has more static compression, it has every bit as good an intake manifold, and the thing that really helps it, and we'll see this when we look at the modified versions, the variable cam timing obviously helps this quite a bit. So the combination between the two, I mean, we're looking at a difference of going from 353 or 4 horsepower, 355 horsepower, up to 405 horsepower. So it's a 50 horsepower jump. And torque kind of took a similar jump. It's impressive. 381 foot-pounds, 432 foot-pounds. So, I mean, who doesn't want an extra 50 horsepower and 50 foot-pounds? And it's not just 50 horsepower and 50 foot-pounds at the peak. It's basically 50 foot-pounds kind of everywhere through the curve. So the 5.3 liter L83 should be a much better, truck motor, unless the new truck is a whole bunch heavier, but that's another story. Now let's take a look at our modified versions. It's not surprising given the years of technology that the Gen 5 L83 would be better than the Gen 3 or Gen 4 5.3 liter. Now, in truth, we did not test a Gen 3 or a Gen 4 version of the 5.3 liter, so it may fare a little bit better with, maybe an L33 or something. It has a little bit better camshaft. It has a 243 head and a flat top piston and the Trailblazer SS manifold. So it may bridge the gap between those two. So for you Gen 4 guys, I haven't forgotten about you. But it's not going to make 50 horsepower. It's not going to be 50 horsepower better. Here is our modified version of the LM7, and it made over 500 horsepower, which is good. It made 503 horsepower and 443 foot-pounds of torque. From a peak power standpoint, it did very well. Let's take a look at how this compares to the 500 horsepower version of the L83. And the L83 squeaked out a little bit more at the top. From about 5,500 to 6,000, they were exactly the same. The modified version of the L83 made 513 horsepower, so it's up about 10 at the top. The peak torque numbers were very, very close. Peak torque, 442 foot-pounds. And then, if I remember right, they were both at 443. So they almost made identical peak torque numbers. But if we take a look at the rest of the curve, we kind of see the real story here. As impressive as the modified, the 5.3 liter LM7 would be, and it is, we know, we made a ton of power with it. I mean, we weighed 1,300 with turbos on it. Take a look at all of this stuff down at the bottom. So from 4,600 or 4,700 RPM, down low, I mean, for instance, down here at 3,400, we have 362 versus 416 foot-pounds. So you have a dramatic difference in torque production, and there are a couple things to consider here. One, obviously, if we made our LM7 11-to-1, it's going to pick up power basically everywhere. So we could elevate this whole curve by going from 9.5-to-1, and actually it probably was a little less than that given the chamber size on the 215 head. So we could elevate this by 6 or 8 horsepower or so, going up in compression, going up, making this thing 11-to-1. But it's still not going to change the torque down here. And the reason for the big change in torque down low below 4,500 RPM, I think, is the VVT cam timing. It's important to note that the L83 used stock heads. The LM7 used fully ported CNC 215 heads. Now, those 215 heads will support way more power than we're using here, but it required good ported heads to get there. It also required more camshaft. I mean, if you take a look at just the intake duration specs on the L83 versus these modified versions, the stage 4 cam from BTR is somewhere in the 220 range, and the camshaft that we use on the LM7 is like 232, so it's more than 230 degrees. So that's at least 10 degrees bigger on the intake duration that was required to get us there. I think that the fast manifold is a longer runner manifold, certainly, than the MSD is. But even though we had a short runner version on the L83 that allowed us to make lots of peak power, the VVT allowed us also to combine that with more power down low. Now, if we had a long runner intake, we'd have even more power down low, but we would trade power at the top on the L83. So here's our comparison, our 500 horsepower version. So the question is now, which 500 horsepower version would you rather have? Obviously, all of the guys that are considering cost are going to say, well, the Gen 3 motor ultimately is probably going to cost less. But would it? Since you don't have to buy ported heads, the manifolds are probably a wash. The camshafts are probably a wash as well, although a lot of guys are complaining about the cost for people to put those in. But putting a camshaft yourself in an L83 is actually not terribly difficult. So again, which one would you pick? Let's get to our conclusion. Okay guys, what did we learn in our comparison between the Gen 3 LM7 and the Gen 5 L83? Well, the first thing we learned is maybe, Richard, you should have used the Gen 4 motor. But at the very least, the L83 is a worthy successor, at the very least, to the Gen 3 and Gen 4 stuff. It continues the tradition, it makes power, and it has plenty of power potential, even in stock-ish trim. I mean, all it took was an intake manifold and the right camshaft to push this thing pretty far over the 500 horsepower mark. And it took a lot more effort, obviously, to get the Gen 3 motor up to the same level. But here's my question to you guys, and I'm hoping you guys will all make comments about this. What about the Gen 4 stuff? And more importantly, what if we used VVT on a Gen 3 or Gen 4 5.3 liter? For instance, what if we took an L33 or an LC9, an aluminum flat top piston 5.3 liter, and then added VVT, the right VVT cam, milled a good set of heads like a 205 trick flow and put that on, ran it with a good intake with variable cam timing. So with the higher compression and variable cam timing and the right intake manifold, could the Gen 4 meet or exceed the Gen 5? Let me know in the comments. I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More testing coming up.